You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
As always, thanks for tuning in to the TeachThought podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development. And if you've happened to find us through iTunes or some other listening portal, I invite you to check out our two websites, which are TeachThought.com, which is our main website, which has all of our blogging content, as well as TeachThought Professional Development's website, which is WeGrowTeachers.com, which has some of that content, but also much more information about the workshops and services that we help schools with worldwide. Also of note is a reminder that registration for our third annual summer learning event, TeachThought Grow 19, is ongoing. The dates are July 16th through 19th. We'll be back at the really great Fraser History Museum Loft in downtown Louisville, Kentucky. We're happy to be partnering with the National School Reform faculty for the pre-conference day, which is July 16th. And that is called Addressing Elephants, where we will use the learning of protocols, which is one of the specialties or the specialty of the National School Reform faculty, in ways that we can help our students learn how to have difficult conversations about difficult topics. So I'm really looking forward to co-facilitating that with the director of the NSRF, Michelle Mattoon. And then we'll go on to July 17th, 18th, and 19th, which is the main part of Grow 19 and centered around our popular Foundations of Project-Based Learning workshops. From those 3 days, you'll walk away with a better understanding of project-based learning, as well as a project for implementation in your classroom or in your school if you're a school leader. Just a side note, you can register for all 4 days of Grow 19, or you can register for the pre-conference day or the main 3 days separately as well. And again, details can be found at wegrowteachers.com/Grow19. Also, please remember that it's really helpful for us to spread the word if you share the podcasts and review them wherever you listen. It helps us to get more listeners, which helps us to get better guests and more guests, and hopefully you find it helpful in thinking more deeply about education and your teaching craft. In this podcast episode, I spoke with Kevin Vanzant, who is a history instructor at Tennessee State University. I was interested in talking with Kevin because of an article that was published in Quillette, March 28th, entitled "A Professor Speaks Out: How New Left Orthodoxy is Failing a New Generation of History Students." And as we discussed in the podcast, I think that title is a little misleading from the work that he's trying to get across, or the point he's trying to get across. And we discussed the article, but also the academic paper that he's hoping to have published soon that article is based on. So we started talking about really the purpose and the importance of the purpose in teaching history and how that relates to ambiguity and complexity and nuance. We went on to talk about some things around ideological clarity, and then his more recent and the success that he's had with this approach of using fiction to address and get at that complexity sort of as a foil or by creating some cognitive dissonance. Towards the end of our conversation, we touched on the importance or perhaps non-importance of the subject matter selection based on who you're teaching to and your audience of students, and how maybe questions as an outcome might be more important than answers, even in history. So I really enjoyed this conversation, and certainly think there's lots of room for deep reflection and thoughtfulness about how we're teaching history and just teaching in general. So I hope you enjoy the podcast. Kevin, welcome to the podcast. As I like to do, I want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and give our listeners a little more context into who you are and how you came to the position where you are and what we're going to talk about.
Well, hello, Drew. Thank you for having me. I'm very happy to be here. One of the most exciting things about sort of talking about what I've been doing in the classroom has been getting feedback. So I appreciate what you do on the website as well as the podcast. As far as intros, it's a little bit hard to know where to start for me. My experience in the classroom, my development as a teacher has been a very winding road. But I guess I'll just go sort of big picture. I teach at Tennessee State University, which is HBCU, which is a historically black college in Nashville, Tennessee. Overall enrollment's around 7,000. I've been there for 5 years. I teach exclusively the U.S. survey, first part and the second part. When I was there for the first 2 years, I was there under a fellowship and an affiliation with Vanderbilt University, which is where I got my PhD, which is also in Nashville, Tennessee. And I was actually teaching a 1-1 during those first 2 years, which was amazing. But it was also a wonderful opportunity to experiment in class, which is impossible now, because for the past 3 years, I've been teaching a 5-5. So I'm a temp professor. I'm year to year. I'm an adjunct, and my course load is heavy. There's two things before we start talking about what I do in the classroom, what I've been working on that I want to note about TSU. The first thing is TSU, you're not going to find TSU on the top of the U.S. News and World College rankings. Many of my students come from uneven academic backgrounds, and that is putting it lightly in some cases. They have not been served well in many cases by the public education system. And this is not to lay blame on teachers. Obviously, these are major structural problems as well. But when I talk to my students about what their experience was, for instance, in a 10th grade history class, the answer is often deflating. So what you have at TSU, which may be different or a little bit more evident than other universities, certainly at a Vanderbilt University, is you have a certain level of cynicism about education. Now, that's not the only thought my students have. They're very hopeful. They're in college after all, but they're not working off many assumptions. They don't assume that college is necessarily gonna be of great value to them. So they're sort of ambivalent in some cases about being in college, and the onus that puts on the teacher is you need to convince them. You can't come into a class, in my experience at least at TSU, and just tell students this is important and they need to do it. You need to make an argument for why this class could be something of interest and of value to them, which, if you think about, should be something that teachers should be able to do. That's part one. The second point I want to make is much larger than just TSU, and that has to do with the crisis in the humanities. I'm a believer in the crisis in the humanities. I think the humanities and history in particular is in trouble. I think you see colleges across the country in small numbers now, but that could change considering canceling history classes and humanities curriculum more broadly. California, I think, has just come out with a proposal to get rid of history and social studies in junior college classes, I believe, which would trickle down to the high school level. I think South Carolina, which is where I'm from, the legislature is considering dropping history from high school curriculum as well. I think it's a major problem. It is certainly on display at TSU. What you realize the first day at TSU, or certainly I did, is that nobody wants to be in these classes. And if your eyes are open, you can't really miss it. Since I started at TSU, I've been doing questionnaires and surveys, querying students about their interest in the class or lack thereof. And some questions I asked, for instance, are who would be taking this class if it was not a general requirement for education in other majors. And if I have a class of 30, no more than 2 or 3 people respond yes to that question. And when I follow up with them about why they think a history class is worth their time, their answer 9 times out of 10 is the sort of cliched justification of historical instruction that if we don't know the past, we're doomed to repeat it, which whenever I try to actually think seriously about, doesn't actually make any sense to me at all. And certainly I don't believe is an effective justification for taking a history class for most students. So the second question I often ask as well, on top of that, is any student considering majoring in history? And I've been at TSU for 5 years. I've asked this question at the beginning of every class, and for the past 3 years, once again, I've taught a heavy teaching load, and I have never had a student answer in the affirmative. So that is what you are introduced to. That's your first day of class at TSU. And how I've responded over pretty much the last 3.5 years is by just trying to figure out a way to teach better. And why I'm here and why I've written the Quillette article and why I have a longer article coming out in the History Teacher is that my classes have improved. If you go back to the beginning of my experience at TSU, my students were always friendly outside of class. We had exciting intellectual conversations in the hallways, and we had conversations that were enjoyable in my office. But as soon as class started, everything would change. And there was something in the presentation and the organization of that class, which was short-circuiting this dynamic sort of intellectual discourse that was apparent in my conversation with students and in every other situation outside of the classroom. So just to give you an idea of what I was thinking about and dealing with early on, I had students showing up late for class frequently. My attendance would drop pretty precipitously as the semester moved forward. I had students reluctant to read extremely short and also undeniably important primary documents. I remember one situation vividly. It was an 8 a.m. class, and it was towards the end of the semester. I was teaching U.S. History 1, and we'd gone all the way up to the Civil War. And I had some quotations on a PowerPoint, which we were supposed to read together and discuss. And I think it had to do with the Dred Scott case, or maybe John Brown or Frederick Douglass. They were interesting quotations. I knew that because other students had plenty to say about them. But in this particular classroom, nobody in the class was looking up to read the quotations. And at that time, I had 2 kids at home. I was tired. I hadn't slept very much. And I didn't lose it. But I was upset that there seemed to be one person working very hard in this class, which was me, right, while my students weren't working hard at the same time. So that sort of is representative of how I felt in these early classes. It had a coercive aspect to it, which was very unpleasant to me. You had to constantly encourage people to come to class. You had to encourage them to give the curriculum a try. And that's changed over time. So if we fast forward to now, I'm in a much more positive place with my classes. Teaching is easy for me now, whereas before it was hard. My students seem to enjoy being there. The engagement has changed dramatically. I have students reading assignments that are 3 to 4 times as long to the readings they were even willing to consider reading before. And this is a good time to be on the podcast because we just finished our last week of school. And the dynamic I have with students when they leave the class for the last time these days is I just tell them how much I've loved coming to class and how great they've done. And I had one student in particular who she sits in the front row. One of my classes, she's a wonderful student. She's always giving me a hard time about numerous things. And as soon as I said this, she said, "I bet you say that to all your classes." And I thought about it for a second. And I told her, I do say that to my classes now because my classes are working. But 3 years ago, I didn't say it at all. So the reason I'm here is just to talk about that experience. My hope is that something in my experience is valuable to people in different situations. Every teacher is unique, every school is unique, but I hope there's something in the changes I've made in my class that other people can pick up on and develop and even disagree with that may help them. I'm very inspired by the need for historians to talk and engage in the public with what we're doing in the classroom as one way to sort of confront the crisis. And when I posted the Colette article, it reminded me that process is not easy. Reading through the comments section of that essay was not easy, light reading for me. But I learned a ton from it, and I think it'll improve my teaching. So I'm here, I'm writing as part of just getting this my experience and what I've done into the open so people can discuss it in the hopes that it's some small contribution to historical instruction, because I think we need to be doing as many things as we can to try to save it.
Yeah, well, there's lots of parallels to not just history teaching, but teaching in general, and sort of the general malaise on students on the part of students. I think at least starting in middle school and certainly present in high school, and you're talking about post-secondary. Just a couple quick clarifying questions. You mentioned 1.1 and 5.5. Can you clarify what those are? And then also, when you say you're teaching the U.S. History Survey in 2 parts, what's the scope? What's the beginning and end of that time-wise?
Sure. A 1.1, sorry about that. A 1.1 college level just means you have 1 class a semester. So a 1.1, how many that it's the first number is how many classes you have in the fall and how many classes you have in the spring. So a research university where research is prioritized, you could have a 2.2 or 2.3, which means you have 2 classes to teach in the fall, 3 in the spring. When you get to teaching universities, you're going to see more 3.3s and even 4.4s. At a teaching university, though, it's only going to be adjuncts who are teaching a 5.5. So my teaching burden is as high as it gets. I've got 5 classes every semester because my only job is to teach the survey class.
Right.
And the scope, as far as the scope, it's absurdly expansive. I mean, historians have been saying this for forever. The U.S. History 1 goes from Pangea all the way up to U.S. Reconstruction in 1877. And then History 2 goes from 1877 to modern times, as much as people actually get to contemporary times, which is always difficult because there's so much stuff to cover.
Right. Yeah. And as a history teacher in high school, I struggled with that. We didn't go back as far as Pangea. We went, I think, from Native Americans, that kind of thing, to usually 8th grade, depending on the state and different schools and districts and things like that. But the scope usually was 8th grade up to Reconstruction, and then usually at junior level in high school would be you'd pick up from Reconstruction and go to current day. Of course, you'd want to go back and do a little bit of review, and I always joked about how absurd it was in 2 different ways. One, as a U.S. history teacher, you're supposed to get to this current day and do all of the things in between justice, and that seemed nearly impossible. And then every year they added another year, so it's like, oh, thanks. I appreciate that. That's very helpful. But the other thing, and I've mentioned this in work that I've done with teachers and maybe on the podcast, is the absurdity becomes much more pronounced when you think of it, although you're talking from Pangea, so this is not necessarily as relevant, but in a high school setting or middle and high school setting, the idea of U.S. history being a long history is, of course, absurd in many ways. I was in France many years ago with a group of students, and I talked with a teacher there. She was a history teacher, and she said, "What do you teach?" And I said, "U.S. history." And she looked at me with all candor, I think, and maybe with some sarcasm, and said, "That's a whole class?" Which, of course, the European or other areas of the world. I mean, the idea that U.S. history is lengthy is laughable, right? And so the idea that we can sort of cover all of that content versus one of the things you talked about here, uncoverage, and we're going to get into it, but the absurdity of that and sort of laughability about it, I think, is part of the problem, because it does feel, and I think survey is the right word there, and it's almost a pejorative, right? It's like just this run through of a list of facts, and I'm reminded of how this plays out for people who are entranced by this guy who's winning all this money on Jeopardy. Now, I haven't watched it. I'm sure he's amazing to watch. I'm sure it's a great story. But the idea of watching Jeopardy to me is I'd almost rather pull my thumbnails out. But because it's not because I don't enjoy watching people win or that story, but this sort of useless outside of the context of trivia or Jeopardy kind of situations, recitation of discrete and isolated facts, as opposed to some of the things that you're talking about in the article, I think is important to note. And again, what got my attention was the article in Quillette, and then the academic paper that you're getting ready to, would you say it's going to be in history, what journal?
It's a journal called The History Teacher.
History Teacher, right? Okay. And just to be clear, the article in Quillette, I think, is an interesting one. But as you and I talked about this before we went live, the title, I think, is not indicative of your position. I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit. The title is "A Professor Speaks Out How New Left Orthodoxy is Failing a New Generation of History Students." And I don't think what your intention is that it's new left or right necessarily, although there's some pieces of that.
Yeah, that's the Colette article. You are correct. The article is an accurate reflection of my idea. The title I would have some quibbles about, but it is an offshoot of this larger teaching problem. And because that article is not out, it's hard for most people to know that. But where I'd like to start and then build up to the Quillette article, because it is a small part of these larger pedagogical changes I've been trying to implement in my classes. So if we go to the curriculum, teachers have been talking about this forever. If you talk about the modern side, U.S. History 2, that goes up to the modern days, that you're always adding a year, this is happening in a million different ways. And you can go back certainly to the first half, and you look at the scholarly explosion in the 1960s, where people were uncovering things about the past that we had no idea about, gender studies, race studies, and so on and so on. And so we thought we knew something about the world, but it turns out there's so much that we didn't know. So that knowledge base expanded dramatically from the 60s and 70s to 80s. And then there was no extra time given to these survey classes. So to your point, you were just adding more and more. And the concern was it was getting into rote memorization. It was superficial learning. And to your point about Jeopardy, I completely agree. I'm impressed if a person knows a lot of facts, but that's not that's not the merit of a history course. There's so many things I'm much more interested in a student to be able to display. I mean, for me, it would be comfort with ambiguity, the ability to encounter a contrary opinion without it rattling you, and try to integrate that into your own perspective. That is when I see somebody who I would say is somebody I want to talk to, or intelligent, much more than somebody who's rattling off the weird answers to weird questions.
Right.
The thing about TSU, which is, I look back on it, I didn't know it at the time, but TSU has just been a dream for me, a dream job. And there's so many things that I wouldn't have realized at other schools that I realized at TSU. And one of them has to do with the fact that almost all my students work. Right. Almost all of them have not had, in my opinion, sort of adequate historical instruction. So that puts even more pressure on the coverage aspect, because you have to go through, you have to build up, right? As opposed to a student who maybe had a great history teacher in 10th grade who this is their second time through U.S. history. So what happened at TSU is the coverage model just completely became ridiculous, because you don't have much time with them to start with to cover this immense amount of stuff. And I couldn't even overload them with readings that could maybe cover the stuff that we couldn't get to in class. So the uncoverage idea you mentioned is very attractive to me. The professor who came out with that, I think in the 90s, just argued that the traditional survey was broken. And by covering so much and staying so superficial, you're actually not introducing students to what makes history interesting and what could make it a valuable experience. And so his argument was to forget coverage and just pick several topics, almost seminar style, and do deep dives. And that was very attractive to me early on, because it seemed to be the opposite of the superficial learning, this memorization-based class. The problem at TSU, though, that I ran into, that I may not have run into at other schools, is that the historical literacy is an issue that I think my students care about. I think historical literacy is important in the sense that, when we're talking about modern contemporary issues, you often make a reference to the past, and it's often assumed that you know what the person is talking about. And if you don't know that reference, that can potentially be embarrassing, or just placing yourself in an argument or a story that's set in a time period. So historical literacy to me is very valuable, and it's particularly valuable, you see it in its absence. So I was hesitant to move all the way to uncoverage at TSU because historical literacy was something I thought my students were interested in, just making sure they could broadly construct American history in a way that allowed them to have these conversations or allowed themselves to place a story or a historical note into the larger context of the trajectory of American history. So I didn't go all the way to uncoverage because I wasn't willing to limit the topic. So I actually wanted to stay broad. So I was really stuck in that sense because I agreed with the pedagogical criticism of these broad classes, but I cared too much about historical literacy to go in to uncoverage. So what I've been trying to develop is a way that I can make still a sort of a broad-based class have some pedagogical merit.
So in your sense, or how do you answer that question of why should we study history? Because I agree with you. The idea, to me, it is laughable, so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past because we clearly are failing at that. So what's your answer if you have a go-to?
I do. I mean, this was the starting point for me. So I'm a big believer in purpose in education is transformative. You can take a bad student who sees no purpose in a class and put them in a class that has purpose to them, and it's like a different person entirely. Have you interviewed Ted Dintersmith?
Yeah, I know Ted well.
Okay, I thought you did because his book was influential with me. I think at the top of his pyramid, he has purpose. Mm-hmm. And when I talk to my students who often undervalue their intellectual ability, in part because they didn't do well in a class that had no purpose to them, I often start by saying, if you didn't do well in a history class that you didn't see the purpose in, that does not necessarily reflect your abilities, right? And you possibly are misjudging yourself. So that's a big part of what I do. And in his book, Dintersmith's book, What School Could Be, that's heavily STEM based. And you surely know this if you've talked to him before. He was a humanities major. So it's this awkward passage in the book, not awkward, but it's just sort of funny because he's going through all these wonderful project-based learnings that all are STEM-based. And then he has this paragraph where he's like the humanities, he's pro-humanities, even though the book seems to be teaching his, if you agree with his teaching philosophy, seems to be saying that we should be doing all STEM all the time. And he doesn't have an answer for it because it's a tough one, but he says historians should be interested in talking and advertising and marketing their disciplines, which is a bad word, right, in academia in a lot of cases. And I remember reading that passage, and the challenge for me was to get his pyramid to work for a humanities class. So the way I approach it, the way I get purpose into the class is through an emphasis on ambiguity. If you go to any humanities conference, the conversation will always be, well, what do the humanities do, broadly speaking? Well, we confront the human being and all its complexity. Like, we're about nuance, we're about ambiguity. And that, to me, really resonates. Now, I'm critical of how much we actually do that, especially in a history survey class, but the idea was very powerful to me. I remember one moment with students where, this is early on, they were telling me all the reasons they didn't want to take this history class, and this was like, the fifth class that had told me, the laundry list of complaints. And at this point, I got a little bit tired, and I wanted to push back a bit. And I told them to wait a minute, that they're complaining about taking one history class for one semester, whereas I've been in history school for 7 years. And, I had no job in sight. So I told them, if anybody should be complaining, it's me. And I was half joking, of course. But when I said it out loud, I realized in that moment I didn't agree with it. And the reason I didn't agree with it is because the humanities education had given me things of value, right, outside the vocational realm. And when I thought about what that was, it was just my comfort in dealing with a very complicated world. And so when we talk about ambiguity, that personally resonated with me. But then the next step was to think about, if my class is prioritizing ambiguity, and what I was doing early on was not. And so many of my adjustments, how I tell the students that this could matter to them, is the world is asking them to think for themselves more, in my opinion, than the world has ever asked people to do. And if we can get better at complex thinking, then they can navigate the world better. And, they don't respond, yes, that's a great idea, but just taking their engagement in the class based off this principle, I think it resonates with them as well, because the world is intimidating. There's a Neil Potzman book from the 70s. He talks about education as helping students survive, and survive is a strong word. But students are struggling with what's often referred to as the fire hose of news, and like how many people have facts which are true. I mean, the post-truth age is often criticized for being fake news, and that's a part of it. But in many cases, it's often just confronting subjectivity, and now everybody has facts that they can find that exist that empower their perspective. And so I think students are struggling with how to believe in anything, how to converse with people, and if you can make the connection between dealing with complexity in the past, creating this intellectual skill set that applies in the present day, I've seen that resonate. So everything I do curriculum-wise, once I started to change my courses, is how do I get ambiguity into this curriculum?
Well, it's an interesting way to think about it, and I agree wholeheartedly that the purpose and the why of what we're doing is really missing, or I guess the why in what students would identify as the why is not something that's very interesting to them in most cases. And Ted makes, great points in his book, and I've had him on the podcast a couple times. And one of the things that we do when we work with teachers, and we do a lot of work in project-based learning and inquiry-based learning, is to think about, ask teachers to think about that. Like if I were going to walk in your classroom, or anybody, and for me, one of the things that I feel like is a pretty quick barometer of the quality of the culture or the teaching and learning that's going on in a classroom is, first of all, I'd ask students what they're doing so they can explain that to me. And then probably more importantly is, tell me why you're doing that. And what we don't want to hear is something like, this is because the teacher told me to do this, I'm doing this for a grade, it's going to be on the test, or I'm going to need this in the future. Because none of those things resonate with very many. I mean, your survey feedback results of 1 or 2 students saying that they would take that class, your class, without having had it mandated to them is pretty clear evidence, right? That it's really not something that they see as valuable towards the future. And I think that's such a missed opportunity. And humanities is, and history is a part of that. Although I don't know that many people think of history as part of the humanities, and I think that's part of the problem, right? So the idea that it adds value and how we can use that, the idea of getting at, in my last podcast, we talked about the idea of tacit knowledge versus focal or explicit knowledge, and that tacit knowledge being something that can be described as like know how versus know that, which is the facts and the Jeopardy approach, right? So being able to use those things and contextualizing. And I'm wondering what you think about, so one of the things that I think about history, and you tell me, I'm curious your thoughts on this, is that we should use, one of the reasons we should learn history is that it helps us to be better citizens, and in a democracy we need better citizens. So to be able to be a better citizen, it makes sense that you would need to know lots of history and kind of the thinking historically perspective. Does that resonate, or what do you think about that?
It does. I've heard a podcast where you've said that good citizenship, I would just probably go a little bit broader. Mm-hmm. That you want students, part of the criticism I got in the Colette article was that I had just gone all the way to opinion and ideology, which is always the criticism of project-based or constructivist learning, right? Like you're just into opinions and now you've lost the facts. And that's always difficult to manage, because I want students to know that they're going to create their own opinion, and then you want to encourage them to make it as persuasive as possible so facts and knowledge come in there. But yeah, for me, good citizenship, I would just go a little bit broader, and I wouldn't say citizenship in my classrooms probably. Mm-hmm. I would just say you need to be thoughtful. you need to be capable of complex thought to survive on a broader level. But of course, I think that also makes you a good citizen.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think if I have a student who by the end of the class is looking at a controversial contemporary, almost all my papers have to do with contemporary issues which connect to the historical issues we've discussed. If they're arriving at powerful opinions, but getting to that opinion by engaging with counter arguments, I think that's an amazing skill set which has hugely positive societal ramifications. But I probably wouldn't use the word citizenship. That could, in my case, be a little bit I almost like heavy-handed.
Sure.
I just say, if you're just trying to make sense of the world and not be continually pushed into a corner intellectually, then you need to be able to take in different opinions and hold complex ideas and different perspectives. So I agree with it. I would probably just go a little bit broader.
Yeah, and I think the word citizenship can certainly have some negative connotations and maybe even be weaponized by some, and I'm curious too, because of your work in an HBCU, obviously through your article, it's clear and in your comments here that has really affected your teaching in the way you think about teaching and learning, but that's idea of citizenship can, as I said, sort of be weaponized of a good citizen of the state, compliance and those kinds of things, which is not what I mean. And certainly the idea of teaching and helping students learn how to think, not what to think. And so really relying heavily on the inquiry and that nuance and complexity, which is what you're saying is that ambiguity.
Right. I mean, that will be my concerns with citizenship. You could read. I thought I listened to your podcast on the Better Angels. Yeah. And I thought what was so informative about that, and I don't mean to generalize overly broadly, but history professors, academics could do if they could access that website and just look at how that terminology plays in the real world. Yeah. Certain words are fine on their own, but they trigger larger meanings. Citizenship would be in that category where you could, my idea of citizenship is very complex and includes dissent, obviously. Mm-hmm. But if I'm not making that clear on the first day, I think you could hear that as this person it wants me to be pro American history. And that I would have to explain that. So I would shy away from that word until we've established we're talking about a complex idea. Yeah. But the way the professors use what Better Angels would call blue words, mm-hmm. without understanding what this could do to the range of ideological ideas that are deemed within reason or open to disagreement in class is something which I could greatly improve on. I found it very informative. I think most history teachers are going to tell you their objective. And I say that because I would have told you that 3 years ago when I started. And what was so great about being at TSU was I wanted to stay with a broad class, but the class had to be smaller because I couldn't assign a bunch of readings. And when you have this huge expansive possibilities, the teacher's going to have to make certain choices. So of course you try to teach those curriculum choices in an objective way, which is why a teacher would say, I'm being objective. We're looking at both sides of the Boston Massacre or mm-hmm. both sides of Thomas Jefferson. But when I stepped back and looked at in aggregate the topics I had chosen, it was clearly a very liberal class, and students are smart enough to pick up on that. And so what I think a shortcoming of teachers, because it's challenging for everybody, is understanding how subtle ideological influence can be in the classroom. And if you're going to make your class ideologically expansive, it's going to take work. And that's what's so informative about Better Angels is it's not easy, it's hard. So if I see a teacher who casually says, oh, my class is really objective, I've grown very skeptical of that, because the response should be, I'm working on it, but it's hard. Mm-hmm. Because it's a difficult thing to do, especially Gary Nash, when he debated Lynn Chaney in the 90s, he said as much. He referred to the historian's craft as closer to a lawyer, making an argument because you're choosing certain facts. And if we think about our class that way, that's a great challenge, which has set up my movement. So how did I get ambiguity into my class? What I recognized was that my class, because of my own personal beliefs, tilted left, even though I was trying my best to be objective. Mm-hmm. And so once I became conscious of that, half of my class then became an effort to open up different readings of my narrative. And when you're talking about purpose in a history survey class, what's fascinating to me is how much people care about the narrative. People care about what American history is, whether it's good or bad. And you can get into this with statute conversations. I mean, people care if they think Thomas Jefferson is good or bad, and they want to have that discussion. But if you do a conventional history class where you set up the facts in the background, right, you front load your information, and then you dig down into this more detailed account of whatever you're focusing on, you leave those facts behind, and then all the action happens with your consideration of that event. What I've tried to do is just bring that full circle. So I make sure they know that my narrative in class is not perfectly objective. It's not the truth. I believe in it. It's based in evidence, but I'm happy to talk about it. And then we dig down into a reading that gives them the ability to loop back to my narrative and say, no, I think you had this a little off. I'm sort of siding more with where this reading pushed me. And then once I'm not against front loading. I'm not against lectures, but you have to make it so that it's not just something to take in that's static. So this snowballs in class, because once they know we're going to bounce back to the original narrative, all of a sudden my subjectivity, which is inherent, is no longer a problem, because I'm not pretending to be inherently objective, and they're taking it in knowing that they're going to come back to it and maybe critique it and maybe start to construct their own sort of historical take of what was presented in narrative form in class. Right.
So having that ideological clarity, there's, I think, two different ways to approach that. And I was always the way that I thought about it as a teacher was to try to be as objective as possible, but you may still say, look, I'm not going to tell you which way I think. I'm going to try to get you to think and ask really great questions, but you may sense one way or the other. And my goal was to really make it so unclear that they would not be able to guess my ideological leanings. But the other approach is, of course, to be very clear and say, look, I'm very liberal, or I'm very conservative, and I'm going to teach I want you to be aware of that in my teaching. And if you're at least upfront about those things, I think that's a first step. But one of the things I think is you mentioned here, and you talk about in your article, not I don't think as much in the Quillette article, but in your more academic piece, is the use of other, it's I think pretty fascinating, sort of flat characters and round characters and fiction as almost like a foil to some of the more left-leaning that you might do, the ways that you might approach it, and let's be honest, lots of history has been colored through, I think you mentioned Howard Zinn, and that certainly more left and liberal leaning lens that Lynn Cheney had really sort of pushed back against.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. The idea that a teacher should not know whether his teacher or whether the student's teacher is liberal or conservative is fascinating. I'm not sure we can pull that off today in the same way we could have. I think that's a wonderful ideal. It's just very difficult to pull that off in the internet age.
Yeah, that's true.
For instance, a teacher is going to have a Howard Zinn poster on their front door and then walk in and try to introduce you to or Karl Marx quote, and then try to introduce you to capitalism. It's not going to take much. And then political teachers, as every citizen has the right to be, are politically active, which is also on the surface. So the only thing I would say about that seems something that I wasn't going to be able to pull off. Mm-hmm. Now, if I was teaching a more specialized class, I bet I could, but the U.S. survey is just going to highlight these. You can't thread the needle. There's no objective possibility, I believe, that I've been able to do where conservatives and liberals are going to be happy with your curriculum choices.
Well, part of it, too, might be the sophistication of the thinkers in the room. At a high school level, it might be a little bit more possible because there's a little bit less sophistication there.
It could be. And at HBCU, I'm coming in. The critical thinking at TSU is just off the charts. You could have lots of reasons for that, but they're ready to critically engage immediately, whereas maybe a high school student's going to give you a little bit more run on some ideals. But about the fiction, the way it started, and what I do want to say is, the exciting thing about what I've developed in the class has been it's come experimentally, in the sense that my classes weren't working, in the sense that I was not getting any students. The Crisis in Humanity pushed me to care about whether students were getting interested in history as a major. That was the metric I was interested in. It wasn't, did they like me, which was great if they do, and it wasn't if we survived. It was like, has this class, encouraged more interest in the subject to the point where you may think another history class is something you're interested in. I mean, once again, I don't want to break it down into these metrics that make it sort of like consumer, but I do think if we're doing something intellectually engaging, a natural result of that will be some interest in taking more classes. So what I wanted to see out of these classes was engagement, of course, but also somebody at the end of class tell me, I wasn't interested in history when I started, but now I'm a little more interested. Maybe I'm more open to taking classes, more interested in taking a history class. So my classes early on were just not succeeding in that area. And I was teaching a lecture on early Virginia in the 17th century. This is how I got into fiction. I didn't think fiction was the answer. I very much stumbled across it. So much of what I've done is trying something, and then if students liked it, trying to figure out why it worked. And if I could figure out why it worked, I did more of it. And so the fiction thing started not with me reading a study about how you could use fiction in a history class, but because I assigned it mostly out of desperation, and it worked. And the first fiction I assigned was Toni Morrison. The lecture that day is on the rise of slavery in Virginia in the 1600s. And it's a very probably conventional lecture. I talk a lot about tobacco production, and then an African-American landowner named Anthony Johnson, who's well studied. There's a very famous book on him. And then we track the laws that became increasingly racist, that tied race and slavery together, which gets you into this whole argument of making slavery making race, or making race making slavery. And it's obviously some combination of the two. But it's a difficult thing to assign a reading for, or at least was for me. I assigned some of the laws, and then I assigned a chapter from the Anthony Johnson book. And it just didn't catch their interest. My students often struggle with readings the farther back in time you go with them, if the language is not fully modern. And I didn't have and my other assignments, which I thought were better readings, weren't going well, and I just didn't have a reading to assign. So I had read Toni Morrison, A Mercy by Toni Morrison for my own purposes, and it is set in the Chesapeake area in the New World during the 17th century. So it's perfect. It's in the context of what we're talking about. It has several fascinating characters, including feminine characters, which gives you obviously a perspective which is not reflected adequately in the historical records. So that gives the text great value. I have found fiction a wonderful tool to bring voices into class. If you do good historical fiction, plausible understandings of individuals who aren't present as much in the historical record. So I signed a chapter from the book, and I can't, it's worked out so well since then. It's hard for me to remember exactly how I felt, but I remember being extremely nervous and pessimistic, because I thought my students were not gonna accept reading fiction. And also Toni Morrison is a difficult read. I've come to believe she's the national treasure, right? But her text is not an easy first read. Most of my students have never read Toni Morrison before. So I expected some pushback. And it also was a 25 to 30 page chapter, which was more than I had been asking them to read in the weeks leading up to it. And when we got to class, I was prepared for it not to go well, and it just did. Students had read it, which caught me by surprise in the moment, and they had things to talk about. And it was immediately apparent to me that something had happened that was better than anything I had done at that point. So as I thought about it over time, the character they see, there was interested in several characters in that book, but the character they were most interested in was this character named Jacob. Jacob is white. He's working for a bank, and he's collecting money from a slave owner. And Toni Morrison goes out of her way through the beginning of the chapter where you're introduced to him to make him extremely likable. He cares about his wife. He was born as an orphan. He wants to make money so his kids don't have a tough upbringing as he did. He goes out of his way to save animals. He saves a raccoon out of a tree. Once you go through it a second time, you see clearly what she's doing. She's making you like Jacob. He's against slavery. He says it repeatedly throughout the chapter. And then he collects money from on behalf of the bank from this person named De Ortega, who is a slave owner, who he absolutely disdains. And then he comes back to the coast after collecting the debt, and he stops in a tavern. And what happens is he's greeted with a proposal to invest in a slave plantation in the Caribbean. And he's reluctant at first. He pushes back on it. But at the very end of the chapter, he falls asleep and he has a dream. And the dream is of a big house, very similar to Ortega's. And the implication, as I read it, is that these two characters, which seem so different throughout the entirety of that chapter, now the distinctions collapse, and instead of being two different people, Ortega has become Jacob's future. And what it did in the book is amazing, but what it did for our class was something they wanted to resolve, because it created a tension with what we had talked about in class. The problem with assigning those primary documents in part was just duplication. I'd already integrated that into my lecture, right? But by talking about this character, in many ways, who worked against the generalizations which I was discussing in class, presented attention to them that they wanted to talk about. So if you talk about purpose or sort of project-based learning, for instance, when this works really well and they want to evaluate Jacob, they'll start to ask me questions, for instance, like, well, was the slave trade the only way to make money during this time? And then all of a sudden you get questions about the historical record, because they're investing in interpreting that character. And as soon as it happened in class, it was clear that this was better, and that I needed to do more of this in my class, because it worked so well with what I was trying to achieve at that point. And at the time, I thought maybe it was just because Toni Morrison's amazing. But as I tried to figure out more specifically why that worked so well, I realized it wasn't just about Toni Morrison. It was about this process of giving them a character which complicated the story I told, which empowers them to have a conversation with me about the story. And it's just been a great success for me.
Yeah. So the thing that comes to my mind, you say tension. I would maybe call it cognitive dissonance, and to that point, which is really the ambiguity, right? So it's something that they can put. You've put things into a more complex, nuanced situation, which brings those questions. And I think one of the things as I was making some notes on your paper, the idea of narratives narratives can continue to exist, just not in static and authoritative forms. They have to be about raising questions as much as answering them. And I think that's a quote from, is it Busnell?
Yeah, or George Saunders. It could be either one.
Yeah. So it is, I think, a really important thing to note there, and that's that inquiry piece, that curiosity, that ambiguity, and the cognitive dissonance that sometimes really, or very often, can really help engage students in a way that is different from, sort of that authoritative, just recitation of facts. And I think one of the things that history teachers in particular fall prey to, I've seen, is that history teachers tend to be in love with history, and especially certain parts and stories of history. And when they tell that story, they hope and they expect and are frustrated when students don't find it as interesting. And I've seen high school teachers who have they're so in love with this story and the idea of narrating and telling this story, and it is engaging and fascinating to them. But you've got students who are sitting there thinking, I don't care. And that is a frustration for teachers. Then it becomes an adversarial position.
Correct. I mean, I think, you could have teachers do things in class which doesn't look good in the moment, but it's based in this frustrated good intention.
Right.
The lack of student interest, I have one story about that. My first syllabus, my research area is in the 17th century. The North American colonies, and there's this Lord Baltimore. I have a paper on it's very boring to the layperson for sure. But there's this Lord Baltimore thing which I feature in my article, which I think is a fascinating document. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it, and I assigned that and I'll never do that again. It did not work. But I think you're right. I mean, I remember feeling I would start classes when my classes were less successful, saying to students, just believe me, this is important. Just stick with me. Give it a chance. This is important. I do not say that anymore.
Right.
And it does. If you think something's important and the class is resisting that easily turns in to something which just gets more and more negative the farther you go. Like, this is important. You need to show up. Why aren't you on time? Whereas, you start to improve your class, and then all of a sudden you don't have as much issue with that. And also, if you believe in your class enough and you have it structured correctly, if a student doesn't show up for class, there's going to be consequences for that reflected in their grade, which I don't have to have an aggressive tardy policy. One of the huge problems with a textbook-based class is there's not a lot of consequence to missing a class. If you're going to do some sort of multiple choice test, you could just read the textbook. But the way I've structured my classes so that I'm not in the position of being like, hey, you need to be on time. That's just a bad dynamic in the classroom for me. So much of the test and what we do in examinations is based on conversations in class. So if a student's missing class, I mean, first of all, they'll run into an attendance issue problem. It's just the school regulations. But then they're not going to, that's going to be reflected on the grade they get on the test. So it works itself out where there's a repercussion for the person missing class, because what we're doing in class is important. So that dynamic has disappeared from my classes. I think it's of value, and I invite them to see if they agree by the end of the class. But if they're not taking advantage of it, the more confident you are in the class, the more you can live with that lack of interest is just a mistake they're making, and you're giving them a chance, as opposed to constantly trying to prod students to be interested and convince them that something's important, right? If you just presented this is important and you make a compelling case, it resolves so much of that, which is really negative. I mean, these kids that I'm getting, the problem particularly with African American male students, have been yelled at plenty.
Right.
By their high school teachers, and they'll shut down quickly. And I'm just not interested in doing it. I mean, the idea should be if I make a compelling enough case for the class, they should want to come and listen. And the better my class has gotten, I have no disciplinary issues anymore, and which was the biggest burden on me. And I know you've taught. Nothing takes it out of me like classroom issues.
Right.
It's a bummer. I remember early on, my wife, midway through the semester, she would be aware of this, because she would know it's about time to have. I would just get depressed. Yeah. She would be like, "Don't get too down. This happens at this time in every semester." Where I was just so bummed by the lack of engagement and interest in what we were talking about, and having a class now that's improved in that area. I don't have that depressed moment midway through the class, and it's just so positive.
Well, it's almost like I don't know exactly what you call it, the Chinese finger torture thing, where you stick your fingers in the mesh thing, and the harder you pull out, the worse it becomes, right? And so the resulting pedagogy or approach, the easiest one to fall back on, I think, we see far too frequently, is sort of that authoritarian, draconian approach, and we're gonna force you to do that. And there's some short-term possible gains there, but the long-term is not. I mean, I think we're seeing the fruits of the long term, or the lack of fruits, and the frustration. And I think it's no secret that engagement in school goes down from elementary to middle to high. There's been a Gallup poll. Sometimes I show that chart. There's a sharp decline, and I remember as a teacher, you say in high school, middle school kids start to lose that engagement, but then sometimes we'll still do it, and there's all kinds of weird stuff happening in the middle school ages. But in high school, you ask them to do work sometimes, and they're angry at you, and I'm not sure that they shouldn't be. Now, that doesn't absolve them of some responsibility. I mean, there's certainly, this is not all the teacher's fault, it's not all the professor's fault, so there is a responsibility on the part of the student to be active, engaged, but there's such a complex and nuanced picture there that I think we have to look at. And to that point, as you're talking about your work at an HBCU, with African American students, and we can talk about the right and left. I don't know if we even need to get into that, but the idea of sort of teaching things that may or may not be more interesting or engaging to them, sort of the idea of teaching dead white men, the works of dead white men, versus things that they might find more interesting. And I don't know how you think. I have some sense of that, but can you kind of give a little bit more detail on what you think about that, as opposed to, I think there's a more conservative approach, and you say, well, these are the things that are important, and we can't dismiss those.
Yeah, I've been very influenced by the numbers of declining interest in school for years now, which is why I read the Ted Dintersmith book, which is a lot of younger students. So that I learned a lot from what history teachers are doing in lower school, to be honest, because they're getting amazing engagement. About the question of teaching at HBCU, that was a real learning experience for me, and I'm very critical of myself in retrospect, because I was very much putting people in boxes who were fully individual and had a wide range of issues. But when you start teaching somewhere, you've got to make some choices. And so what I've done to combat that is I just talk to students all the time about what they want to cover. As far as the idea about in a U.S. history class, I'm a complete, basically agnostic on, there's not 15 things you have to cover. There's so many important things to cover. I don't really care that much about what we choose to cover. And that's because I'm focused on ambiguity and complex thinking. So if we get there through it's better if they're interested in the topics. Now, I have some, evaluation of the historical importance of things, but there's so many important things to talk about that I just start that was part of the surveys. I was a survey a nutcase for a while because I was just so interested in collecting information. And one of the things I would ask is, what do you want to cover? And so I would have a discussion with African American. Some of my classes are 100% African American. Some cases, there's a big international student population. In some cases, there's a few white students. In some cases, not. And I would talk to a black student. I'd be like, what do you want to cover? And they would say, well, I'm at HBCU. I would like more attention to be paid to the history of race in America. And you hear that and you're like, totally makes sense. That's great. And then you talk to the student sitting right next to them and they say, well, my opinion is I'm at HBCU. I get so much emphasis on race in my other classes. I would like us to talk about other issues. And what becomes apparent is that you cannot thread the needle subject matter wise. And so I'm changing the subject matter all the time, but the answer for me has never been in subject matter. So when I came there, when I showed up at TSU, I had been trained more extensively than most PhD teachers, more than most PhD students when they go into the teaching realm. Because I was on our fellowship, I had an extensive workshop I participated in. Vanderbilt does a decent job relative to other PhD programs of actually having some teaching instruction in the class. So I had not just showed up at TSU with some haphazardly put together syllabus. I had carefully crafted a syllabus with the help of a lot of intelligent people. And part of that was subject matter selection. And what I realized was that's not the answer. So what took me to a point where I thought it could have a broader application was if I had just done this myself, I would have assumed, well, I'm messing everything up. But I knew my syllabus was academia approved. And so that began for me to think on a much broader level about how we're thinking about these classes, because it wasn't an incompetence issue because I'd had so much help prepping my class, but it wasn't working if the priority was getting the subject matter right, that there's no right answer to that because you've got a class of 30 individuals all with incredibly divergent interests.
Right. So it's not subject matter per se, but would it be fair to say, or does this make sense to you to approach it from some of the desired takeaways, or a major desired takeaway is that they would come away with a really good understanding of what questions are important to be asking as a historian, and perhaps about these particular periods or figures or things like that. So I tend to think, I don't know if this example resonates, I tend to think that the way that we think about, for example, Confederate statues or artifacts and things like that is not that we should necessarily take them down. I think there's maybe some arguments that can be made for some of those being removed or that kind of thing. But what's I think more interesting and more important is not that the statue is there or not there, but how we think about it. So I think we're missing the conversation, and what questions should we be asking about a statue of Robert E. Lee or Thomas Jefferson or anybody, right?
Right. Yeah, that's a fine way to look at it for me, and also just to inspire them that these issues are complicated, not simple, and that they deserve some time, or like going out and finding information, and then you got to be able to navigate. I think media literacy is a big thing that we should think about incorporating. I've not developed that in my class at all at this point, in my classes at all. But so I do statues as well. I mean, one of the things that was so exciting once I just stopped thinking about history, these classes in a conventional way, is I almost used assignments early on as an extension of my surveys. And I would just ask them some question I had no idea what the answer would be, and I couldn't wait to read their papers. And at first it was a way to learn about them, but then I started to figure out or start to believe that it was just a better way to do a history class. And to your point, like if you just pose a question and you tell them, I don't know what you're going to say about this. I know we prepared for it by talking about these issues, but on this particular issue, I've got no idea. That's invigorating. And I tell students all the time now, I mean, reading papers, more conventional history papers, I'll never go back to that again. I'm always trying to create a paper where I'm asking them something I haven't. If everybody goes one direction on the paper topic I ask, that's an unsuccessful paper topic.
Right.
So when you talk about statues is fascinating to me because there's no answer to that. If a student makes an argument that Confederate statues should be taken down, plenty of my students do. I'm very open to that argumentation. Other people say this reminds us of some bad stuff. To your point of how to look at it, you can have an African-American student say, no, this reminds us of the past. We don't want to forget this. And Thomas Jefferson statue, revolutionary statues, that's one of the paper topics I've asked in the past. Mm-hmm. And my expectation for it is if you're going to make an A on a paper for me, it can't just be your argument and your facts. You have to engage with the other side and try to integrate that, refine your position so that you can hold those facts, which may mean something to somebody else. And what's been so exciting about it and the completely unexpected is that allows people with different political views actually to start to have conversations, even if they end up in disagreement, because by taking that route to their own opinion, in most cases, they've humanized the opposite position. So if you think about I think you talked to the Better Angels about the fishbowl technique they do. You have the Republicans on the inside and the Democrats just watch. Right. How that breaks down categories, and they see that their endpoint, the political endpoints, which they disagree with, but they're watching them get there, and they're not getting there from bad motivations, and how that can bring people together, not in the sense that they agree at the end, but they're like, I've got to read on how you ended up here, and it's more complicated than I thought. Right. You can do that. I mean, that when you're talking about a paper like that is what I'm looking for. That's a priority for me. Evidence-based would be a priority for me. Facts matter. But then also, can you handle a different perspective in your argumentation and refine your position? So it's sort of the same dynamic. And what it is at the end is we're able to have much more complicated and risky conversations at the end of class because the class has started to humanize each other in a way that like snap judgments are less likely. So as my teaching has developed, focus on ambiguity, I've been able to go into areas that I would have been worried would split the class into just sort of simplistic categories. But that's so about what questions to ask, but also understanding that the world involves you considering a different perspective. And if you're gonna exist in this world, you have to be up to that challenge. So that's what with the statue issue, I'm looking for. Can you consider that different position and not run away from it and still believe in something or make a strong argument? And being in the middle is fine too. If some students indecisive about the issue, that's fine. If they're like both sides have merit, but in most cases they arrive at a point of view. And if that point of view has come through a sort of a complex consideration of different point of views, that's a very positive thing for me.
Yeah, so it might be a good place to wrap up. The idea of balancing that historical literacy, which is having at least a fairly comprehensive, and not necessarily deep, but a fairly comprehensive sense of the overall history, but balancing that with what are some really important pieces of that overall broad scope, but probably more importantly, what are the questions that we should be continuing to ask? And that's why one of the things, and I recognize the idea of citizenship is probably laden with some values or could be weaponized, as I mentioned, but that it does beg some questions for me, and I could see using that as a lens to teach. And one of the things in the Quillette article that you mentioned, I think is a really important point, is that the idea of sort of being ideologically safe is, I think, a really bad place from which to approach not just teaching and learning of history, but everything. That you've got to be able to simmer in that ambiguity and be able to be challenged. And part of that is that to be able to be challenged, you have to be able to have some sense of being able to sort of challenge back, which is knowing some things and understanding some things. Also some humility of, I might be wrong about this, and there's that complexity and that nuance. So I think it's obviously a really difficult thing to do, but as you've mentioned, and I think it's laudable that your thoughtfulness about teaching history is on display here, because I think it's not something that lots of history teachers do. So I want to make sure that folks have a way to reach out and whether they want to respond to you or get in touch with you. I know the Quillette article will link to that, as well as some of the Better Angels things that we've linked to. But any other places they should find you?
Academia.edu. Okay. I hope to have some more publications coming out soon, and certainly if there's interest in what we've talked about today, or the Colette article, and the larger issues of how ideological diversity in the classroom can be a touchy issue these days. I would encourage people to look to the history teacher article whenever it comes out, which I hope will be soon, because I'm able to go into sort of the pedagogical roots of where this idea of ambiguity comes from and what it means if we identify our own subjectivity. Because if we believe in that, then we're assigning things that challenge our own ideas. And because I'm in the dominant political group within academia, that means I'm assigning things that challenge the ideas of academia at large. So if people are interested in that, because I think it has huge pedagogical potential, and not to overdo it, but to maybe help save the humanities. And the humanities is always about complexity. That's always, to me, been the thing that has made it of interest across time. And I think we're in a situation where we need to adjust how we get that complexity into our classes. So I would encourage Heterodoxy Academy, any Better Angels, any group like that. Chloé Valdary in New York Times, she does the theory of enchantment. Anybody who's just trying to figure out a way to care about structural issues, but also value individual variation on ideas, that's out there. And in some ways, what I've done in class has confirmed these broader ideas that people are talking about as important. So there's increasingly great resources out there if people see some value in when I think your word's great, cognitive dissonance. And then trying to identify where you lean and how you can go about challenging your own ideas in a productive way in class, because I do think it has a great future in instruction if we can develop it a little bit.
Yeah, it's certainly, I think, really important. I think as we develop sort of mindsets being less impatient with people's ideas and more impatient with their unwillingness to ask questions and simmer in that nuance and complexity, because I think that's where the way forward lies, and it's it's a rocky road. I mean, there's no answers, and that's part of the problem, is that history has been taught as, in many ways, a set of answers, and it really, I think, should be more a set of questions. But Kevin, it's been a real pleasure, and I appreciate the time and the work that you're doing. Hopefully we can, and folks will find the article, not just on Quillette, but your article that is the more academic when it does come out, because having looked at it, it does dive into the pedagogy a little bit more. So I appreciate your time.
Well, it's been great. I really appreciate you having me on.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, teachthought.com and wegrowteachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.